Thank you so much, Berta. First of all, I would like to say a very warm welcome to everyone. I see, as Berta said, a lot of people that I know and a lot of people that I don't know, which is always really a great pleasure, and from all corners of the world. So I think that's really a good start to a discussion. So as Berta said, this is part of a webinar series that the IRCT is hosting, focusing on the theme of sexual torture and really trying to dig in and understand at a very detailed level what it is, what is the damage that it causes, and what can we all do to really fight for justice, for reparation, and of course ultimately to prevent sexual torture. And this is, I think, for all of us, it's a very difficult topic to discuss. It is a topic full of extreme violence. It is a topic marked by silence, marked by both by people being silent and being silenced. It is a topic that has historically been underrepresented, been under scrutinized, and therefore also less well understood, even though it has always been there. So if we look at the statistics from the IRCT movement, our global membership support approximately 70,000 torture victims each year, and out of those, more than 10,000 are victims of gender-based violence. So of course we have slightly different definitions at play, but it still tells us a lot about and that's by all estimates a very small number that represents a much larger, let's say, iceberg under the water. So it is a really difficult but also very important topic to discuss and to address. And therefore, we were extremely thrilled when Alice, the Special Rapporteur on Torture, decided to take this topic up in her thematic report to the UN General Assembly, a report that has just been published, and that we really hope it already has, but that will generate an increasing momentum for the anti-torture movement to address this issue, because of course it sits in many different sectors as well, and for us to have these difficult discussions about what can we do and how can we address it best. The report itself is, for those who have not yet had a chance to read it, is really I think it's a really important milestone in this work. For me, it sets out some very important ideas, problems, some solutions as well. I think 3 highlights for me in the report is one, the proposal to really shift the conversation about stigma from victims and survivors to perpetrators. Another is the fact that the report actually quotes survivors themselves, both from the Kinshasa statement coordinated by the Global Survivor Fund and from the recent survivor hearing in Latin America. So we have the voices from survivors directly represented in the report, which of course from IRCT is a very important element. And it also lays out a lot of interesting and inspiring good practice of how to do rehabilitation in this particular context. So those are just 3 of many important elements of the report. But of course, the report has one big problem, which is that it has a very limited number of words that it can use. So we will always end up scratching the surface of it, and that's why we are bringing people together now for this series of webinars to really say, okay, but but let's take the conversation further. Let's take some of the ideas that are presented, but though briefly in the report, some of those that maybe are not, and get them on the table and really take this forward. So, so for me, I think I'm really excited for, even though it's going to be some difficult times together this fall. I am really excited for this to move forward. So for the first discussion, we are really going to try to set the stage and have the more, let's say, conceptual part about what is sexual torture, what is it not, and so on. And we have some brilliant speakers with whom I have worked with for a very long time in many different capacities. So it's really a pleasure to be here with you. And I will introduce first Alice, and then Berta will take over and moderate the rest of the session. So without further ado, I'm really happy to introduce the first speaker, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Alice Edwards, who's going to be talking to us about her report and this particular team. So it's really a warm welcome to all of you, and a warm welcome to you, Alice, and thanks again for taking up this important topic.
Thank you so much, Asger, and also Berta, for organizing a series of webinars on the report, and really on the topic of the report of sexual torture. The focus was on wartime sexual torture. I imagine you may also discuss more broadly, depending on the context in which you are working. I just think it's a wonderful initiative, and for me, very gratifying to see that a report is brought to life through this process. There's a lot of work that goes into the background, and I'm very grateful also for, I had 46 submissions, many of them from the IRCT network. I also had the wonderful support from Asger and the Global Survivors Fund and others helping with the rehabilitation section. And I also had the great it's always hard in this domain to say great pleasure, but it was a pleasure to travel to Erbil and Duhok, Iraq, and to meet with survivors of ISIS crimes, and to hear from them very directly about how they think things could be done better, what has helped them in their journey to recovery, and also some aspects of legal developments that they have found useful and effective going forward. So the report has been an amazing collaboration from my side. Today I'm only able to stay with you for the first part, but I am going to be back in December, and Grace Chen, who is online and who is my research coordinator through the Geneva Academy, has been intimately involved in drafting and researching the report. So she's here to participate in the discussions and, of course, feed back to me information and anything that's interesting for me also to address in the final session in December. I'd be happy to do so. Essentially, the report sets out that sexual torture is a form of torture, which I call the ultimate imposition of power over another human being through sexual means. And these are described also in paragraphs 17, 21, and 22 of the report, including intrusions and aggressions against the intimate or private areas of a person. Now, I was asked recently about what that means in more detail. Of course, we're talking about sexual and reproductive organs, but we're talking about more than that. And it was left reasonably broad, following also the Istanbul Protocol and the latest update, which also includes areas around sexual torture, because a lot of sexual torture starts also with encroachments on one's personal space, and may not involve the sexual or reproductive organs, but may be of a sexual character, either through verbal assaults or through unwanted touching and threatening and intimidating behavior when one considers that this is within the context of a power relationship. So as Oscar mentioned, of course, running in parallel, I guess, is the conflict-related sexual violence agenda and the women, peace and security agenda. And there's no intention to displace that at all, but I think there are advantages both for victims and survivors, but also investigators and prosecutors in more fully utilizing the torture framework. Now, what is a bit strange about this is when we didn't have crimes of rape and sexual enslavement, etc., recognized, for example, that's now recognized in the Rome Statute, we were actually having to craft these types of assaults and aggressions through different means, and the torture prohibition and the torture frame was one of those. And then we were all very pleased when rape and sexual assault were all identified as specific crimes. And in a way, the pendulum maybe has swung too far the other way, and we've lost some of the advantages of framing these assaults and attacks as torture. And I just wanted to mention 4 of those today, and then I'll hop off the line. But there are, in the report, one of the most important things from my perspective is there's a call for action, and it's really to garner support and utilization, and also just more thinking and discussion around how to make these areas compatible, but also so that ultimately the goal is that victims and survivors.
I heard a bunch of birds tweeting.
Somebody has their gets the support that they need, and that they are able to proceed to court if that is their wish, but also so that we can prevent this type of torture occurring. I also think there are a lot of good tools in the torture domain, and obviously a large network of practitioners working on these issues on an everyday basis anyway. So we don't want an artificial separation, but there will be times when the torture framework is particularly relevant and applicable. And so those 4 things, just to mention in the call for action, there are more than these 4, but for today's purposes, 4. One is that on the torture area, we have a robust binding torture framework or anti-torture framework. 174 states parties to the Convention Against Torture, which applies both in wartime and in peacetime. The definition in Article 1, I would say these days, is customary international law. There are no disputes about that. That's a solid description of both acts of torture, but also potential crimes of torture. Some variations if you're an international lawyer in relation to war crimes and crimes against humanity, but the essence of that definition of the infliction of severe pain or suffering for the purposes of doing things such as intimidating, oppressing, extracting information or a confession or discrimination remain at the core of that. And that framework, I venture to say in the report, is stronger than the framework we currently have on violence against women or gender-related violence. There is no statute of limitations, as you know, on crimes of torture, whereas in domestic laws, including military codes, there are often time limits of 3 or 6 years after which a victim and or survivor is not able to make their claim. No immunities and no amnesties are explicit, and the penalties are generally higher than those at domestic law for rape. So the convention, you know, says that these must attract the highest penalties to recognize the gravity of the offense of torture, which is a jus cogens and erga omnes violation. The second that I think is very useful to the inclusivity to the torture framework is its inclusivity. It's not a women and girls framework. It's not in the minds, even if rape and sexual violence is also not a women and girls framework, but has become almost associated with that. So it allows all victims to be able to, in my view, speak more freely about what has happened to them and not isolate the sexual violations with the other violations, which may be all part of a continuum. Not always, but in a lot of cases, it's kind of the escalation when other forms have, for example, failed to intimidate the prisoner, has failed to break their will, then they may move to these other considered more serious violations. The third area is shame, and Asghar already mentioned. The report spends some time in trying to shift the shame from victims to perpetrators, and that in a way is about the fact that there's no shame in being tortured. We don't talk really about shame and torture, yet we talk a lot about shame and sexual violence and sexual assaults and rape. And of course, all of the people in this group, I imagine, you know, the immorality of this crime is not on the victim. It is the immorality of the perpetrator. And we need to start really pointing the fingers and exposing that level of absurdity in how we talk about these crimes. So in a way, it avoids a victim who's able to express what has happened to them and have it classified as torture, can avoid that shame. They can proudly say they are a victim of torture. They may be a victim of sexual torture, but they get to say they're a victim of torture. And it's and I think there are benefits, and I hear that from victims and survivors who don't want to be labeled as victims of rape, etc., would prefer to be part of the mainstream. And the fourth is around consent. All these very fraught arguments about, especially rape as a form of sexual torture, these questions about did the person consent or not. Well, in torture, we don't ask people whether the beatings they received at the hands of the military officer, they consented to them. We don't ask them whether, if they're hung up in the room, they consented to them. Why are we asking them about consent when this is all part of a continuum, when sexual acts are at play? So in a way, both for victims and survivors, but also investigators and prosecutors, it may free them from some of these otherwise very tricky legal questions that also allow perpetrators to, in a way, distort what might be occurring in, say, other forms of rape within the context of torture, which is one of a coercive environment and an abuse of power relationship. So I think that's just what I wanted to put on the food for thought today. There's more in the report, but I think already those areas are quite interesting to tackle and to think how they might be helpful to you in your work. And I really look forward to hearing back and to seeing you back in December. I'm doing a series of kind of promotions for the report and trying to get the message out there. I'm really grateful for anything that you in your own domains would be able to do. Also, I think this is an issue that is prevalent in almost all conflicts. And as conflicts are rising around the world, the ICRC last week reported to me that they've updated their statistics. No longer more than 100 conflicts around the world. They're now counting 120. It's a very dire situation, and the risks, therefore, of this type of violence are greater, coupled with the fact that modern wars often have more female soldiers, which also adds to the risks that they may face in that domain. But best of luck for today's discussion, and to you, Berta, for navigating what I'm sure will be a very interesting discussion. And once again, thank you very much for doing this and for having me today, and I'll see you back in December.
Thank you so much, Alice. We really appreciate the brief presentation of the main points stated in your report, which is available in 6 languages, and I will share the link in the chat in a few seconds. We will be referring, obviously, to the report throughout our upcoming discussions in the webinar series, and also will greatly inform these conversations. And yeah, Alice, we look forward to have you in the session in December.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. And we will go now to the first speaker with us. Her name is Nora Sveaass. She's a psychologist and an expert on refugees, human rights violations, and psychological consequences of torture and violence, as well as treatment and rehabilitation. of victims of torture. She's professor of psychology at the Department of Psychology of the University of Oslo, and I'm sure of many more hats that feel free, Nora, to comment if I forgot anything. But without any further issue, Nora, the floor is yours, and I will be sharing the screen when you tell me to do so.
Thank you very much, Berta, and very good to see all of you, so many friends and colleagues that I've been seeing in different parts of the world. And also thanks a lot to Alice for her presentation of a very valuable report and the very important points that she raised already in the beginning of this session. And as to the presentation, I can just add that I was a member of the CAT for 8 years and member of the subcommittee on prevention of torture also for 8 years. So I will speak a little bit with referrals to that, but I will start by saying that I want to talk about the conflict-related sexual violence, sexual torture as part of armed conflict. And this has already been touched upon, so I will try to make some reflections upon this. So the question posed today, what is sexual torture and what is it not, is, as has been said already, quite a big one. It's a difficult one, and it involves a range of different topics such as definition, culture, and context. And I think perhaps that the most important part of the webinars and also the webinars to come is that the question is raised and that we can discuss it among ourselves in the different centers where we are as professionals, and with a focus on the prevention of sexual torture and on the rehabilitation. And I know that these issues are taken care of also in the report, but of course we're speaking about a very wide and problematic issue. But I would like today to start with a story about my own attempt at obtaining funding and support for psychosocial work with women who had been exposed to sexual violence as part of war. In fact, I traveled to Geneva and spoke to people there. I was very interested in the possibilities of applying to the UN Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture and others that might have wanted to support survivors of these kinds of severe violations. This was towards the end of the 1980s, so it's a long time ago, and I was involved in civil society organizations in situations of conflict. But what I was told in Geneva very clearly is that this form of violence, that is rape in war, could not be considered torture. It had always been a part of warfare, lamentable as it was, but as we now would have said it, it was collateral damage in war. It was not torture. Again, this was in the end of the 80s. So there was no support to be obtained for this. So I will now very briefly outline some of the historical background to what we are discussing today. First of all, how this form of violence, conflict-related sexual violence, finally became known for what it is, namely torture, crime against humanity, war crimes, and even ethnic cleansing. We know so well today that sexual violence in war and conflict before the 1990s was not registered or documented. It was severely underreported. It was not considered politically relevant, and in most cases, the perpetrators were never convicted. The survivors not given any form of remedy or redress, and there was hardly any research on the topic, and sexual and gender-based violence against women in war and conflict was not a part of the human rights agenda. But fortunately, with strong engagement from civil society organizations, in particular feminist groups, action and awareness about what was happening changed this situation. And this awakening and call for action was followed by treaty bodies in the UN, especially CEDAW and other UN bodies. Because it was with the wars and armed conflicts in Rwanda and in Bosnia, when the world finally recognized and acknowledged that rape had become a weapon of war, that things started happening. And we are now in the beginning of the 90s. So again, it was the reports of rape and other abuses against women in the armed conflicts in Rwanda, 1990 to 94, and former Yugoslavia from 91 to 95 that brought attention to the subject after such a long time. Seeing the issue as the closest to physical integrity issues and the kinds of violations already addressed by human rights bodies, and finding widespread agreement in all world regions about the prevalence of this form of abuse, NGOs made it the centerpiece of their advocacy aimed at the June 1993 World Conference on Human Rights. There, the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action declared that abuses against women were an inalienable, integral, and indivisible part of universal human rights. And then investigations and resolutions saw the light of the day. The Security Council's Commission of Experts investigated violations of international humanitarian law in the former Yugoslavia and identified systematic sexual assault in its priority. This was in 1993. The Security Council's resolution identified from 1992, identified massive, organized, and systematic detention and rape of women, in particular Muslim women, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, as acts of unspeakable brutality, and urged for further investigation. The UN Commission of Human Rights, Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, concluded that the sexual violence served as instruments of ethnic cleansing in 1993. And again in 1993, the Statute of International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia included rape as a crime against humanity, as well as the crimes of torture and extermination. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda decided that rape constituted a war crime and a crime against humanity, and was the first international court to find an accused person guilty of rape as a crime of genocide. Finally, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in 2002 included wartime sexual violence in its list of crimes against humanity and war crimes, and defined sexual violence as rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, or any form of sexual violence of comparable gravity. As Navi Pillay, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, said in 2014, victims of sexual violence bear the cost of the harm they suffered with dramatic physical, psychological, and material consequences, which destroy not only their lives, but often also the lives of their children. This creates irreparable damage to the very fabric of societies and in turn poses serious threats to the prospects of reconciliation and sustainable peace and development. I like this quote from Navi Pillay, so I frequently revert to this. But before she said these words, a lot of important steps were taken. First of all, in the UN, in particular in the Security Council, and we know, and Alice has already referred to this, we saw a number of very important resolutions on this issue, starting, of course, with 1325, where for the first time, women's security was considered relevant for international peace and security by the UN Security Council. Then follows 1820 from 2008, recognizing sexual violence in conflict as a weapon and tactic in war, and also war crimes and crimes against humanity. And we have the further ones laying ground for a special rapporteur on sexual violence in conflict. And we have one also later on talking about the root causes of sexual violence, and also referring to our brothers, because for the first time in 2016, there was also a referral to our brothers, meaning that also men and boys, not only women and children or girl children, are exposed to sexual violence in war and conflict. And this opened up, of course, for a big new aspect that I know will be discussed also later today. So what do we know about the numbers of sexual war crimes? We know from Bosnia that there are very high numbers, difficult to know exact. Some people say 20,000, others would say 50,000. We know that the estimates of Rwanda genocide sexual violence also range from 250,000 to 500 individuals. We know that more than 3/4 of Liberian women were raped during this country's civil war. And the Democratic Republic of Congo reports are tens of thousands of women raped during the conflict, spanning for more than a decade from the mid-90s. We know also high numbers from the conflict in Colombia, and we will hear more about this today as well. And we know from Syria, we know from Sudan, especially Darfur, and now also lately the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And from the very beginning, there came serious reports on sexual violence against women, against men, and against children, and also elderly people by Russian soldiers shortly after the invasion. And the then general prosecutor in Ukraine, Irina Vendiktova, she expressed already some few days after the invasion itself that there were serious allegations already on sexual crimes against both men, boys, girls, and women, and that this has to be documented and investigated in order for one day justice to be done. Also, these crimes are investigated by other society, civil society in Ukraine, among them Juryfem, which is the organization of lawyers. So again, we speak about ongoing crimes and the need to document and to investigate what is happening. So why do we speak about war, sexual crime in the context of torture? And then I will revert back to some of my experiences as member of the CAT myself, because torture is often spoken about and referred to as something that happens to men, that men are the main victims. And we know also that men are exposed to sexual violence in detention. There are abundant examples and evidence regarding this. And this will also be, as I said, talked about later on today. And often, if I as a member of the CAT asked states about torture and violence against women and girls, I was frequently told, but they have their own conventions, CEDAW and CAT, meaning that they were not the main targets or the main to be discussed under the CAT. Of course, this has changed quite a bit, but still it's important to think that this is not ancient history. So what often falls outside the concrete work to denounce and stop torture is the massive torture that women are exposed to through rape, sexual harassment, and severe humiliation in armed conflict and war. And these violations, to me, meet the definition of torture. That's why I think it was so clear and good what Alice said in the beginning about the need for a torture framework, and I couldn't support that more than that. So because what are we talking about? She also referred to Article 1, because when we're speaking about sexual violence and sexual torture or sexual abuse of women in the context of war, we are talking about intended pain and suffering. That's no doubt, with a purpose. So there is a purpose, and the purpose is to humiliate, to threaten, or to punish women. And it's often performed, most of the time, performed by a person in a public role, such as soldiers, police, or their associates. And the criteria for reasons of discrimination is very relevant also in this context. So the many attempts to keep these forms of serious human rights violations outside the discussion and work against torture is very wrong. So Berta, I think you can put up my slides. I will now ask you to share the screen with a few slides that I'm bringing in.
Perfect.
So the story about these violations and others inflicted on women has now been dealt with by CAT, and the way this has been done has been described in an article by myself and Felice Geer in the Torture Journal last year. So I want to refer to this. The Committee Against Torture Tackles Violence Against Women, a conceptual and political journey. Thank you. Next. And I also want to remind us of what are the severe consequences of the conflict-related sexual violence. First of all, to the individual survivor, to the family and group, to the community, and of course, the many children born of rape. Next. And I want just to finalize with referring to a manual or to work that has been done by an organization called Mental Health and Human Rights Info, where we have tried to develop training for those who are working with survivors of sexual violence and torture in the context of conflict and war, both women, the next, men, and children. So these you can take note of and have a look into these. And I want to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion. And I hope that making just a brief overview over some of these historical aspects, which also Alice touched upon, in some way broadens the discussion, and look forward to listen to my co-speakers today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nora. Thank you so much. And I actually didn't have to remind you of the time, so that was perfect. Just to remember everyone, I will be sharing the links to all these resources in a bit in the chat. Also, I can see that Linda from NSC Canada, she's also sharing a book here in the chat. So feel free to also use the chat for that, yeah, to share resources. And due to time, I think we will try to leave the questions at the end. So I will move directly to the next speaker, Christy Fujio. I'm not sure if I pronounced it correctly. She's the executive director and co-founder of Synergy for Justice, based in the United Kingdom. So Christy, if you want to go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Berta. Thank you, everyone. It's nice to see you. As Berta mentioned, actually, I'm in London today, but I'm usually based in the United States. It's amazing to be part of a forum with people from around the world. So thank you so much to the IRCT for organizing this. So my organization, Synergy for Justice, is a multidisciplinary organization that works to advance accountability and to combat impunity for torture, sexual violence, and other human rights violations. A big part of our work is also to make sure that survivors have access to holistic responses following the torture and sexualized torture that they've endured, and that they can try and return to their families and communities and keep moving on with life and not feel chronic compounding impacts over time. So today I'm going to talk to you about the work that we've been doing in the Syria context, working with male survivors of sexualized torture. So this follows nicely from Nora's presentation, actually, because of course, Syria, we're also talking about a conflict area. As you know, the war has been going on for more than a decade. Synergy for Justice has been working in the context, or I have been working in the context since 2013. And we are partnered with a fantastic local Syrian-led organization called Lawyers and Doctors for Human Rights. So we started our work there to build capacity for Syrian doctors to do forensic medical evaluations for torture and sexual violence. We knew that no one else was doing this in a really systematic way there, and that this would be important evidence to further accountability and to combat impunity. So we started, as I mentioned, back in 2013. We did the training, based on the Istanbul Protocol, as I think most people here are familiar with and have probably undertaken or delivered many sessions of the Istanbul Protocol training. Following that, we developed a standard form that we have worked on and refined over the years so that the doctors, would have a standardized form to go through. It provides a format for them to move through the exam and the clinical interview. And also, really importantly, it provides this huge, very rich set of quantitative data that we can use, which is, the sort of the foundation of the research that I'm going to talk to you about today. I'm going to take just a couple to view the standard form. It's extremely, I'm going to share my screen. It's a very long form and very dense, but I just wanted to give you a flavor for it so you have an idea of how we're capturing all the data, and particularly regarding sexualized torture, etc. So it starts here with a very robust informed consent process, which you're all familiar with how to do that, of course. And then what's different about our process is as we talk in detail about what are the different options for where the evidence could go. Of course, the survivors have complete control over where it goes. So they may want to send it to other countries for universal jurisdiction cases. They may want to send it to kind of fact-finding or commissions of inquiry, things like that. Basically, we set out a number of options for them, and they can choose to share their information in redacted format or completely unredacted format. So that's a big part, because the purpose, of course, of doing the forensic medical evaluation is to support the survivors, but also to be building this evidence base that will be used in cases in universal jurisdiction or whatever. So again, I can share the form later with those who are interested in it. So that's why for purposes of this, it's just kind of to show the foundation for the research that I'm going to talk about. So a number of questions here. And then, of course, as you know, the expert sets out their qualifications. I think this is pretty standard, probably in the standard forms that you're using as well. Patient information, the standard things. And then we move on to starting to talk about, what was the medical history prior to the torture, sexual violence events, prior to the detention, so that we have a baseline of what they were experiencing before, and we can use that to measure what are the impacts they're feeling, immediately after and years after the sexualized torture events that occur in detention. So here again, here we're capturing information related to particular locations, and that's because in the case builders, when they're collecting evidence and building their cases and prosecutions, they'll often come to us and say, hey, do you guys have any cases that took place, let's say, between 2010 and 2015 at this specific branch that involves sexualized torture, for example. And so we capture that information here so that we can provide to those prosecutors and case builders the particular data sets and information that they're looking for. So here we start to capture, just with tick boxes, all the different kinds of physical and psychological torture. Later in the report, there's an opportunity for the doctor to write narrative as well, of course, to provide a richer context and a fuller picture of what's going on. But these tick boxes are extremely important to be able to use the data in a quantitative way, to identify patterns, and to be able to think about what's happening to people, and so how can we provide support following that. So remember that. So here's where we get into talking about the sexual violence, sexualized torture. This, as you can imagine, is very difficult in some cultures, and so we've spent a lot of time trying to get people comfortable with this terminology and with asking these questions. Of course, they have to ask it in sensitive ways, but we also want them to, if they look uncomfortable, if they feel uncomfortable, the clinicians themselves, then the survivors are also going to feel uncomfortable. So we spend a lot of time. You can see it's very blunt, very clear language, because it has to be for case building and to get at the clarity of what happened. And then the opportunity for patients to report on what are they feeling, chronic conditions, etc. So I think, and then of course, as you know, it's the photos and descriptions, how do the photos and how the correlation, basically, consistent with, not consistent with, highly consistent with, etc. So they're going through this. There's a whole section on psychological assessment. I think, so sorry, I know you're probably blinking or going blind from this. I just wanted to see. So at the very end, they do the overall conclusion, of course. So I think you're very familiar with this kind of Istanbul Protocol style of evaluation and the standards that attach to that. And I know there are lots of different standard forms out there. And I think actually it'll be a great future project. I'm not sure if the IRCT is doing this or not, but for maybe at some point we should all be looking at our standard forms and even standardize them sort of across entities or countries. But sorry, that's beyond the scope of this presentation. So let me get back to it. So you see the form. We realize we have this huge, really rich data set, and that was one thing we, as it was growing, as we did more and more evaluations. By earlier this year, we had done already more than 650 forensic medical evaluations there, and they all are documenting the physical, the psychological, and the sexualized torture as well. So we have this data set, and we also, the one thing that really struck us early on was the huge percentage, nearly 100% of people being forced to endure forced nudity, basically. This was something we saw, and I'll share more numbers with you, but that was the one data point because we didn't expect this. We knew that the physical torture was brutal, going into it, basically, like in 2012, 2013, we knew anecdotally that the sensory deprivation and other kinds of psychological torture was also prevalent. Physical was brutal. But we were surprised and increasingly surprised to see how much sexualized torture was being used, not just against women, but about men as well. So we have also previously, we've reported on the use of sexualized torture against women in the Syrian context. But because our data set contains many more male cases, we decided to focus, and because it's, people are used to hearing about sexual violence and sexualized torture conducted or perpetrated against women, less so against men. Of course, Nora raised it, but I think it's we're having to increasingly raise awareness that this is happening in a lot of places. So that's why we wanted to focus our research on men. So we went back to look at our data. We looked at all the men who had brought up in the course of their initial forensic medical evaluation if they had mentioned that they experienced any forms of sexualized torture. Then we went back to them to get informed consent to include their cases, of course, de-identified, but to include their cases as data for the whole research. And then also to ask them if they would participate in semi-structured interviews where we could get much more information from them. So we wanted to have a deeper and broader understanding about the impacts and how those impacts change over time. So, what things stay with them 5 or 10 years later versus what things kind of fade or maybe even go away over time. We wanted to look at social, economic, and legal aspects, gender roles and expectations, and the radiating impacts on families and communities, as Nora just mentioned. And as you all know, it's not just about the survivor themselves, it's about all the people that are around them and how they're impacted as well. So I'd like to share some of the key findings with you. So the first was that all of the men that we interviewed experienced multiple forms of physical, psychological, and sexualized torture. Many of them had prolonged detentions in different sites. Sometimes they were in one site for a while, let out for whatever reason, and then rearrested and tortured again in another site. So there's compounding harm of the different types of torture, and also the multiple detentions and the uncertainty of living in Syria over the past, more than a decade. I mean, decades, arguably. The common physical torture are the things that you all see, I think, in your work, being slapped, punched, kicked, hit. 60% of men reported that they were tortured with multiple devices, and 48% reported being burned or electrocuted. 80% reported suspension and forced positions. So that's the physical torture. In terms of sexualized torture, more than 97% reported that they endured forced nudity. So this was, as I mentioned, the data point that first shocked us and made us start thinking we need to look more into this. More than 94% experienced verbal sexualized abuse. More than 45% experienced direct violence or trauma to the genitals or anus. More than 43% were forced to witness others who were being sexually abused and tortured. And almost 10% of men in our cohort reported rape. So during the detention, of course, there was near universal reporting that during detention, there was acute pain, bleeding, skin infections, sleep disturbances, fear, sadness, anxiety. All of this, of course, was very prevalent, as the men reported it, very prevalent during detention. Over time, though, because we were interviewing many men who had been actually out of detention for several years already, ostensibly, they're safe, they're back in their communities, but the physical and psychological conditions continue, right? So many of the ones that remained were psychological, avoidance, intrusive memories, lack of trust, isolation, anger, low self-esteem. Many still had chronic pain from different conditions, and many were suffering from depression and anxiety for many years. There were a lot of important changes in the behavior, personality, and how they reported how they felt, not only how they felt, but how they interacted with their families. And of course, many of them are very aware too of how what impacted them is impacting their families as well. So in terms of some of the things that were more challenging for the men to talk about is that about more than a quarter of them reported erectile dysfunction and other kinds of challenges with intimacy, sexual relations, even with their wives and long-term partners. 71% reported a lack of knowledge of available support services, and almost 60% reported that they were too embarrassed to seek these services. So we know that angry, distrustful, isolated men also have like a lot of resulting physical risks as well. So substance abuse, cardiovascular disease, dementia, stroke, depression, anxiety, and other kinds of premature death are very common in people who have these psychological feelings. It goes from the head to the body. So, as Alice talked about, and Nora as well, I think, what we knew this anecdotally, or we knew it intuitively, I should say, but what we realized through the research is that the sexualized torture does have much more serious impacts for people. They had been, many of them for maybe perhaps a short time, but many of them for much longer times placed in extreme positions of powerlessness, helplessness, vulnerability, and all of those feelings kind of seeped into their heart and soul and minds and stuck with them, and then had the resulting physical impacts. So there are several policy implications that I want to touch on briefly before we move on. Obviously, the critical importance of prevention. The Syrian conflict rages on. Even Assad seems to be perhaps being rehabilitated by some states. So as long as that happens, as long as he's rehabilitated, people are going to continue to be sexually tortured in Syria. And so, we need to continue. It's not our scope, perhaps, to work for, we're not in diplomacy or trying to end the war itself, but we really need to push hard on accountability, because that does seem to be one area where maybe we can make progress for Syria, and perhaps as a deterrent for other settings as well. We're also very concerned about the impacts on transitional justice for Syria because of this. These 4 negative symptoms that we saw increase over time: anger, lack of trust, self-isolation, and low self-esteem. These symptoms can be drivers of violence within families and communities. So this really can impact post-conflict peace building, reparation, and economic recovery. When combined with poverty, forced displacement, and perceptions of injustice and neglect, these are recognized risk factors for radicalization and extremism, and really pose a lot of risks and uncertainty, I think, for a future Syria. The third point is about the radiating impacts amongst family and friends and community. So we want to ensure that people understand that anti-torture programming needs to focus not just on the survivors themselves, but also to recognize that the collective harm is there, and the collective harm also needs to be addressed. So, work through stigma has already been mentioned a couple of times. It's something we work on, and I know it's going to be talked about in a future webinar with IRCT. So we look forward to that, because I think it cannot be stressed enough how important stigma is and the role that it plays in preventing people from moving on, from seeking justice, from seeking health services, psychological care, and things like that. The following point is about the need for specialized services for men. So the men, as I mentioned earlier, many of them didn't know where services were, or they were too embarrassed to find the services. Probably we can imagine, because there aren't many specialized services that advertise themselves as, you know, being there to support male survivors of sexualized torture. So we need to make sure that there's meaningful access to medical, psychological care, social and livelihood support, lots of different things that men need following their experiences. Everything has to be tailored to their needs. The services must actively seek to reduce gendered barriers and to enhance men's sense of dignity and encourage them to engage in more help-seeking behaviors to help themselves and to help their families as well. You know, we know that men are reluctant to see themselves as victims of torture, and especially of sexualized torture. In the forensic medical evaluations that we did, no one comes forward and says, I'm a survivor of sexual violence or sexualized torture, right? They might come in and say, I was detained, and then slowly more and more of the story comes out. Another lesson learned that we had was not to assume that male survivors want to see male service providers. Many do, but some of the ones that we worked with preferred actually to work with women. So it was just an important reminder for us to never make assumptions for men or women for any survivors of sexual violence, torture, sexualized torture, never to assume that we know their preferred gender of who they would like to work with. So we also want to make sure that specialists, anyone dealing with the survivors, are familiar with the many impacts from sexualized torture. So both physical and psychological, also the ones that intrude onto their sexual life and intimacy issues in there, as I mentioned. Oh, I think someone else did that, not me, right? Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'm trying to stop the sharing. Yeah.
So we want to make sure that the providers are comfortable, understand erectile dysfunction and intimacy issues and are able to talk about those things. Again, making sure that they themselves are comfortable about it so they can have comfortable discussions with the survivors about it. Sorry, and then finally, that the intervening specialist should, again, not just think about the men, but think about how the men's health, the men's psychological health, how the men are perceiving themselves and feeling, how that impacts their families and communities. So, you know, as I mentioned, most of the men who come forward are not coming forward saying that they're victims of sexualized torture. But when you have the really careful, specialized training for the doctors who are doing the documenting, and when they take their time, they're very sensitive, that's when you can get the full stories out of people. The men who participated in our research were overwhelmingly positive and really relieved to have had the chance to talk to someone about their experiences, because, you know, of course, many of them are too embarrassed to talk to their friends or their family about it. So having the opportunity to talk to a trained doctor who was aware of the impacts of sexualized torture was really a huge relief to them, even just to talk. And then the ability to have referrals for specialized care, of course, were life-changing as well. Because many of the men, when they showed up for their initial forensic medical evaluation, were shattered. You know, they had, they already experienced so many things, not just the detention, but forced displacement, poverty, other things, the inability to, you know, provide for their families in many cases. So, you know, they are at a low anyway, already not feeling like, or feeling like their masculinity was challenged, or that they weren't men as much as they were before the war. So this is something that the providers really need to keep in mind, and something that our providers kept in mind at the whole time. And that's where the point of making sure that the services really enhance men's sense of dignity and give them back control, and make sure that they feel the control, and that they can feel strong again and not feel crushed by the experience. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I know we're tight on time, but our findings are included in a full medical journal article. So after I wrap up talking, I'll put that link in the chat, and you can take a look there. You can also find it at our website as well. I'll leave it there, but I know some people put questions in the chat, but I couldn't follow the questions. So maybe at the end of the session with Berta's kind moderation, I'll answer as many questions as I can. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Christy. And yes, as you mentioned, there's a couple of questions in the chat, which is great, and we encourage you to do so. We hope we will get at least 10 minutes at the end of the session to address those after Clarisa's presentation. But otherwise, I encourage you to keep having a discussion in the chat. I see Maja, for example, from Dignity, she's addressing a question to Nora and you, Christine, on the definition of sexual torture and the term sexualized torture. So you're welcome to keep the conversation there. Otherwise, we'll meet at the discussion at the end. And now I will introduce Clarisa as our third and last speaker. Clarisa Lemus, she's a psychologist at CAPS Colombia, Centro de Atención Psychosocial CAPS Colombia. And without further issue, Clarisa, the floor is yours. El escenario virtual es tuyo.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días en esta parte del mundo para todos y para todas. Gracias por la invitación a participar en este seminario. Para nosotros y nosotras aquí en CAPS es bastante importante podernos dedicar estos espacios de reflexión y de análisis de una problemática tan grave como lo es la tortura sexual y basada en género. Nosotros en CAPS somos una organización no gubernamental que estamos trabajando desde 2002 con víctimas, líderes, lideresas, defensores y defensoras de derechos humanos que han sido afectados por el conflicto sociopolítico que vive Colombia desde hace más de 50 años. En este camino también hemos encontrado que han habido muchísimas víctimas de tortura y nos hemos dedicado en una parte de nuestro trabajo a afianzar nuestra visión sobre este tema tan difícil y tan álgido en Colombia. El tema de hoy, tortura sexual y tortura basada en género, nosotros hemos ido como aprendiendo en el camino que es una situación que se está generalizando, que es bastante compleja, y sostenemos que no solamente ocurre en sitios de detención permanente, sino que también se da en el conflicto armado, como Nora ya lo mencionaba al inicio de esta charla. En el conflicto armado tenemos reporte de muchísimos casos que han habido tortura sexual. También estamos viendo cómo a partir del estallido social se empezó a realizar tortura sexual en escenarios de protesta social, que uno diría pues hay menos posibilidades de realizarlas. Sin embargo, se dio y queremos hoy conversar con todos y todas sobre cómo ha sido esta situación en Colombia. Yo voy a compartir pantalla, una presentación muy pequeña que tengo por acá de pues algunos puntos que no quiero que se me olviden en la conversación y por eso pues tenerlos en una presentación. Entonces en Colombia la tortura sexual y basada en género pues se ha visto tanto en el conflicto armado y en la protesta social. Han habido situaciones que nos han hecho a nosotros como darnos cuenta que tenemos que también hablar de estos temas porque sin ello, perdón que me perdí un momentico aquí en la presentación, no sé en dónde estoy.
Estamos en la primera pantalla nosotros.
Quiero moverla. Ahí.
Aquí.
Ahí. Bueno, alguien en el chat decía que si se podía trabajar un poquito más sobre la definición de tortura sexual. Nosotros consideramos que tortura sexual son todos aquellos actos que afectan y que van directamente hacia la parte biológica de la sexualidad. Y hacemos una diferenciación entre tortura sexual y tortura basada en género, aunque realmente comparten muchos aspectos juntos. Es como una unidad. Pero en la tortura basada en género se realizan estos actos inhumanos y degradantes con el fin de dañar o hacer uso de algún aspecto de la identidad de género. Entonces, consideramos que se presentan debido a una confluencia de factores que actúan de una forma interseccional, es decir, que están unos unidos junto a los otros, y que por supuesto está presente el patriarcado. En el patriarcado hay como unos intereses específicos y algunas como vulneraciones a ciertas poblaciones, a ciertas elecciones, especialmente a las elecciones de género. Entonces, por eso consideramos que el patriarcado juega aquí un papel importante. Hay un ejercicio de control social en la tortura, que ya lo han comentado también anteriormente las otras panelistas, y hay un uso de la fuerza desproporcional. Y todo esto con miras a generar un acto que castigue en la guerra, un acto que se considere como un castigo, una amenaza, una forma de decirle a las personas, tu opción de género no es la correcta. En el conflicto armado se ha ejercido como arma de guerra para controlar a la población y para mantener el status quo de un organismo, de un grupo en particular. Consideramos que es tortura, aunque pues con la presentación de Nora sabemos que esta discusión ha avanzado bastante. Ya no solamente se considera que son actos de violencia sexual, sino que ya se considera que son tortura. Pero queremos también enfatizar que se dan actos crueles, inhumanos y degradantes en contra de la sexualidad y la expresión de género de las personas y no solamente de las personas, sino que también argumentamos que esto va en detrimento de las comunidades. Por supuesto que hay una intencionalidad de dañar a la persona en su ser integral, de obtener algún tipo de información, de controlar o de coaccionar o de castigar, porque se considera que las opciones de género que han tomado las personas son erróneas, no son las hegemónicas, y por eso habría que castigarlos. Vemos una sistematicidad en cuanto a que hay unos actos permanentes que se van generalizando en los escenarios que se presentan. Nosotros, como les comentaba antes, lastimosamente empezamos a ver cómo en el estallido social se empezaron a dar unos actos repetitivos en contra especialmente de mujeres que llevaban a los sitios de detención inmediata que aquí se denominan CAI, y allá las sometían a desnudamiento forzado, a posturas sexuales forzadas, y esto fue sistemático en varios lugares, en varios CAIs que habían en Bogotá. Por eso sostenemos que, por supuesto, que también hay una sistematicidad. Y usualmente a las víctimas hacia quienes se dirige son personas que están en vulnerabilidad o que son disidentes políticos, y pues más adelante les comentaré también como también personas que son disidentes de género. En Colombia esta tortura ha sido ejercida por grupos armados, por la fuerza pública también, y lo que notamos es que ha sido con la aquiescencia de los funcionarios públicos que parece que no escucharan o no entendieran que eso se está dando a pesar de los reportes que se van generando con respecto a la problemática, y no se generan políticas públicas para poder tratar de minimizar todos los daños que puede generar la tortura sexual y tortura basada en género. Por eso decimos que sí es tortura, aunque como les comentaba, pues ya Nora nos había mencionado cómo este tema ya ha sido avanzado en diferentes organismos y ya se considera tortura. También la tortura tiene unas dimensiones, afecta, por supuesto, a la dimensión psicológica. Más adelante les comentaré, y también Christy nos comentó algunos de sus elementos. Afecta, por supuesto, el aspecto físico de las personas, la biología, el cuerpo de las personas, pero queremos también mencionar algunos elementos de cómo se afecta la dimensión psicosocial en este tipo de tortura, porque como pareciera que esa tortura se realiza en escenarios individuales, en donde se está un poco al amparo de la vista de los demás, como que no tuviese consecuencias para la comunidad. Sin embargo, sabemos y conocemos que se afecta gravemente la posibilidad de respuesta de las comunidades ante esto, ante esta problemática. Hay dificultad en la asociación en poder responder ante esto y asociarse comunitariamente para poder hacerlo, y relación entre las comunidades. Esto porque hemos visto, por ejemplo, que se afectan liderazgos específicos con el fin de que, como la tortura sexual es estigmatizante, estas personas queden como personas que no pueden responder o que no pueden seguir realizando sus labores. Buscan impactar por eso a comunidades enteras. No solamente es el impacto individual o familiar, sino que se busca que una comunidad o un grupo social también se vea impactado por esto. Ya la Comisión de la Verdad aquí en Colombia, con su reporte en 2002 y en su capítulo que habla sobre las violencias basadas en género, nos habla de las violencias por prejuicio, que son aquellas violencias que se dirigen a ciertas personas por sus características o sus elecciones de género, y también se han dado por sus elecciones políticas. Entonces, en Colombia durante el conflicto ha sido muy reiterativo esta violencia por prejuicio, y esto hace que se afiance aún más la tortura sexual y la tortura basada en género. Como se generan estigmas hacia las víctimas, estigmas con respecto a que fueron torturados sexualmente, de pronto las personas no quieren hablar, especialmente si son personas que se quieren tener un liderazgo y que quieren mantener un prestigio determinado. Estos estigmas llevan a que la comunidad o los rechace o no los acepte del todo, o no pueda procesar de alguna manera todo esto que ha ocurrido. Y pues ya lo dije anteriormente, se dirige contra personas disidentes de género, sobre todo comunidad LGBTQI+, y también a personas disidentes por razones políticas. En CAPS hemos conocido casos en donde una persona dirigente, líder y defensor de su pueblo indígena es además atacado en su sexualidad por su elección de género. Entonces, es como una confluencia de factores la que estamos viendo acá. Y pues también esto conlleva a que haya una dificultad para denunciar lo que está ocurriendo, lo que ha ocurrido, y porque el aparato del Estado no está preparado para recibir estas denuncias, pueden haber posibles escenarios de revictimización frente a esto, por lo cual sabemos que hay un poco registro, no se ha registrado todos los casos que realmente van ocurriendo durante el conflicto o también en los casos de protesta social. Acá puntualizar un poco qué hemos encontrado en Colombia con respecto a este tipo de tortura. Ha sido usado como arma de guerra y como castigo ejemplarizante para decirle a las personas no debes hacer ciertas cosas. Desafortunadamente, las mujeres han sido el grupo más victimizado. Aproximadamente de las personas que han mencionado que han tenido tortura sexual y tortura basada en género, son 90% aproximadamente las mujeres que han sido más victimizadas, y también la comunidad LGBTQI+. Se ha dado esclavitud sexual, se han dado violaciones colectivas, ha habido acoso sexual, ha habido obligación a presenciar actos sexuales, desnudez forzada, y la unidad de investigación de la JEP nos ha estado informando con respecto a que se están dando en este momento en Colombia violaciones sexuales en contra de hombres cisgénero, especialmente por un grupo armado que es el Clan del Golfo, quienes, si las personas no pagan las extorsiones a las que están siendo sometidas, les realizan violaciones sexuales como una forma de escarmiento por el no pago de las extorsiones. Entonces, esto es una práctica que se está generalizando. Y también han habido violaciones sexuales en contra de personas reconocidas homosexuales, esto con el fin de generar un escarnio público hacia estas personas. Y también, en un caso que yo tuve conocimiento, le argumentaban a la persona que se hacía como una forma de que fuera una terapia de conversión y que la persona dejara de manifestarse como homosexual. Estas son algunas de las más prevalentes situaciones que se han dado en el conflicto armado. Y en la protesta social, pues también vemos que de nuevo la prevalencia es mayor contra las mujeres. Aquí tengo un pequeño eh, punto que hago con respecto a la campaña Defender la Libertad, que ellos estuvieron documentando todas las agresiones que se daban durante la protesta social y de lo que se pudo registrar, aunque sabemos que no hay un buen registro de este tipo de agresiones, por lo menos hubo 18 agresiones sexuales en pocos meses. Podemos hablar de 3 meses. Pudo haber tortura sexual. Y esto pues porque también se considera en una norma patriarcal que el espacio público no es para las mujeres y que tampoco el espacio de protesta social debería ser para las mujeres. Y en cuanto a la población LGBTQI+, es porque se juzga además por su orientación sexual. En estos casos se ha podido documentar durante la protesta social que ha habido desnudamiento forzado, posturas físicas forzadas y tocamientos que lo ha realizado la fuerza pública. Ha habido violaciones sexuales y ha habido agresiones verbales que buscan el castigo por ser mujeres que protestan. Entonces creo que tenemos que expandir también nuestro foco de trabajo, no solamente a los espacios de detención o a la guerra, sino que también tenemos que pensar un poco que en la protesta social está ocurriendo este tipo de hechos. Varias dimensiones se pueden dañar con esto. Christy también ya nos exploraba un poco en este tema. Acá lo que podemos adicionar es muy poco con respecto a lo que ella ya comentó, solo que nosotros decimos que se afectan estas dimensiones físicas, psicológicas y psicosociales y que interactúan entre sí y que al interactuar entre sí hacen que el daño sea mucho más prolongado, mucho más difícil de manejar. En lo físico, por supuesto que se afecta la sexualidad, la salud sexual y reproductiva. Pueden haber dolores crónicos, cambios corporales demasiado fuertes y dificultades en experimentar la sexualidad y placer luego de que se ha experimentado la tortura sexual. En el aspecto psicológico, algo que hemos visto muy recurrente son dificultades de autoestima y de autopercepción, dificultades en las relaciones interpersonales y, por supuesto, las afectivas se pueden llegar a afectar y algunos efectos derivados de la ansiedad como insomnio, pesadillas, inestabilidad afectiva y fallas en la memoria, sobre todo cuando lo que tenga que ver con el recuerdo de los hechos de tortura sexual vividos. Pueden todos estos daños convertirse en un síndrome mucho más grave cuando ya podemos decir que se ha dado o ansiedad o depresión, porque estos síntomas prevalecen durante mucho tiempo, se mantienen durante mucho tiempo y pueden llegar a afectar de una manera bastante grave a las personas. En lo psicosocial, que también pensamos que interactúa con los otros, no lo consideramos como una categoría separada, pues se aumenta el estigma social, se rompe el tejido social, puede haber aislamiento y desconfianza, y también la afectación de liderazgos y la defensa de derechos humanos. Frente a todo este panorama, nosotros consideramos que se pueden hacer varias acciones que son bastante importantes y que, por ejemplo, este tipo de encuentros como el que estamos teniendo hoy es un paso para poder empezar a reflexionar y a pensarnos cómo poder hacer frente ante esta problemática. Hablamos que en estos casos debe haber una atención integral en salud. Para nosotros una atención integral en salud implica que todos los profesionales de salud que tengan que ver con la problemática estemos atentos a poder resolverla, a poder tratarla, a tratar de manejarla. Y en ese sentido es muy importante que tengamos en cuenta que tenemos que prepararnos también en temas de género para poder entender por qué se da esta situación y cómo afecta a las personas de una mejor manera. Entonces, no solamente es necesario que nos preparemos como médicos, psicólogos o terapeutas, sino que tengamos el enfoque de género bastante claro para poder acompañar mejor a las personas. Sí pensamos que es importante conocer y divulgar, exigir al Estado que se cumplan las recomendaciones que el CAT ha hecho en materia de tortura sexual. Ocurre que no siempre se conocen y es una forma de presionar para que ese tipo de situaciones dejen de ocurrir o se minimice al menos su ocurrencia. Pensamos también que es importante trabajar en coordinación en red con otras organizaciones defensoras de derechos humanos que estén trabajando en la problemática y que podamos hacer sinergias que nos lleven a dar un mejor acompañamiento a las personas con las que trabajamos. Documentar los casos y por eso me parece muy importante el formato que nos enseñó Christy sobre cómo están documentando los casos de tortura sexual en Siria, porque este tipo de aproximaciones nos va a permitir conocer la prevalencia, conocer cuáles son las situaciones más repetitivas y para nosotros es importante también que esto quede sistematizado para poder apoyar en las demandas de justicia, reparación y garantías de no repetición. Entonces, estos formatos se hacen con el objetivo de poder ayudar a las demandas de justicia que las personas tienen, pero sobre todo y ojalá que se evite la revictimización. Y al tratar esta perspectiva desde un análisis un poco más amplio que podría ser el psicosocial, nos permite situar a esta tortura en contextos socioculturales específicos, mucho más amplios, para que también quienes han sufrido este flagelo puedan tener menos sentimientos de culpa y entender que la tortura sexual y la tortura basada en género se realiza con el fin, puede ser de acallar una población, de evitar liderazgos que están siendo importantes y evitar que se cumpla como sus demandas. Esto puede ayudar a que los sentimientos de culpa se disminuyan y a que las secuelas psicosociales, no solamente las individuales, sino las psicosociales, las comunitarias, también se atiendan. Creo que eso es todo por hoy. Les agradezco mucho por este espacio, por permitirnos compartir un poco nuestra visión, nuestra perspectiva de lo que ha venido pasando aquí en Colombia. Entonces cedo la palabra, dejo de compartir y cedo la palabra a Berta.
Muchas gracias, Clary. Muchísimas gracias por explicarnos cómo lo trabajáis desde CAPS Colombia. También, sorry, I'm gonna twist to English. So also to explain us how you look at this type of sexual violence as torture and the different forms. I think I'm aware of the time. I would like to ask you to kindly stay for at least 5 more minutes after Halpa so that we can have a bit of a conversation and address a couple of the questions that I can see many questions in the chat. I'm going to go to the one that is clearly linked to the discussion today, the one from Maha from Dignity. She's asking about the definition of sexual torture and the term sexualized torture. So I'm not sure if Nora or Christy or Clarisa want to address or say something about it. Also, anyone from the audience, feel free to go on mic. Now we're kind of officially opening the space for discussion.
Nora, do you want to go ahead or? Okay. Yeah, so briefly, I'll say, we have only started using sexualized torture as an organization recently, to tell the truth. In the early years, when we approached the documentation in the Syrian context, we didn't realize the extent to which torture and sexual violence were going to be intertwined. We expected that we would see sexual violence, maybe rape against women detainees, for example. So we expected we would see torture and other kinds of sexual violence. But now not just now, but we realized pretty quickly actually that they're so closely intertwined in this context. And so that's why we have turned to the phrase sexualized torture. and including things I saw, sort of the question about definition. I don't have an official definition. I don't know, probably other people do, the SRT probably, and IRCT perhaps. It includes forced nudity, verbal sexualized abuse, direct violence to genitals and anus, forced witnessing of other people being sexually tortured or raped, etc., and rape itself. Of course, any kind of penetration, things like that. Those are, the elements of sexualized torture as I see it, but I don't have a formal definition. I'd be happy to collaborate with others if we need to, but I think there are some good ones out there.
Thank you, Christy. I'm not sure if the others want to say anything about that. I'm also going to quickly refer to how Dr. Alice's defines sexual torture, or what she includes under this, but please feel free to go on mic. I'm not sure.
I'll just,
Nora, go ahead.
Since it was raised, as I said to everybody in the chat, I would really want to look at the fact sheet that the Dignity has developed on this and look into that, especially based on the way that Alice introduced this whole today. I think she raised a lot of very important questions, and I think the kind of definition that you gave, Christy, describing all the different elements that one could say are important, but they're not necessarily, it doesn't cover everything. I mean, what should we say when someone is being threatened with the information that we are going to rape your daughter, or we're going to rape your husband, or whatever? I mean, is this sexual torture? Is it psychological torture? All of those things that, I mean, we are human beings. We are one big piece with a lot of elements. So I think what we can do is to see that in all sorts of torture, that all the different aspects that may happen to people. And I think also Clarisa described this so well in her presentation, that some of these are included in our understanding of what we're talking about. I think the overarching issue is that we're talking about torture. And this is, I think, again, the torture framework is what we really need to do this work, and that we have a lot of different forms of torture. We have always been talking about different kinds of torture and different methods of torture. And I think we're now expanding on our knowledge of what is included in the term sexual torture or sexualized torture. I will reflect a little bit more about this, and I would want to come back to you in Dignity and your very important work on the fact sheet. So thanks a lot to all of you for good comments.
Thank you, Nora. I'm going to invite anyone. Asker, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Berta. Maybe just to add to that, this discussion about definition, if we look at it in a very, let's say, narrow perspective, I think from our perspective, it is much more important that with this report, well, not only with the report, but talking about these acts as torture, sexual torture, takes us into a different framework. So, and just like we do with other types of non-sexual torture, we don't really provide an exhaustive list, right? Because practices change and so on. So I think it is much more about understanding how these elements fit with the violence and so on into something where we can talk about it in the anti-torture framework, and therefore also use some of the good tools that we have there to address these issues. So I think from our perspective, it's maybe not so important to have a very clear kind of delimited definition of what is and what is not, but rather to actually inspire everyone to look at these practices from a torture framework perspective. So yeah, that was just a little side.
Berta, this is Grace. Can I just jump in here for a second?
Jump in, Grace.
I figure out how to raise my hand. I'm sorry. For anyone that's interested, Dr. Edwards' report touches on, the definition, but not, I think, similar to what Asker was saying. This isn't a situation where you can list out all the things that sexual torture or the acts could cover. But if anyone's interested, I could turn you to, it's that paragraph 21, 22 of the report. I'm sorry, Britta, are you linking the report to them? Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I've shared it, but it's at the beginning of the chat, so I'll reshare it. It's
Okay, so
the link where you can download it.
I'm just going to copy and paste it into the chat, and then people can take a look.
Perfect.
Yep.
Yeah. There you go. So is there anyone, I invite anyone else who has reflections on that or is also struggling with this, or maybe this is affecting the way you work or can work with survivors? Again, I see many questions that are, sorry, Maha from Dignity, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for reflecting on this. And just to say, I do think it's important because when we're documenting torture, I think it's very difficult to, and almost a bit superficial, to try to say this, you know, that this is psychological torture, this is physical torture, this is sexual torture. But at the same time, in documenting, and we work also with a legal team and so forth, it is important to be able to identify if there are sexual elements to a torture, to use the term you used, elements. But I also think it's very cultural, what is considered sexualized and what is not. And that's why we struggle a bit with our data, for example, from Gaza, where there is a lot of forced nudity. But the forced nudity, the intention from it seems to be more about humiliation and, you know, that kind of psychological effects rather than the classic definition of sexual. And I think that is, you know, we are debating this a lot, and it's a big discussion of when are we entering into the sexual realm, because I don't think we can take it as just purely biological, that as soon as the skin is shown or as soon as it's related to a sexual organ, then we're talking about sexual torture. So anyway, just it's nice to hear also that, you know, that it's not so black and white, and that it is something that many are debating. And I just like to invite us maybe to also contextualize and when we talk about sexualized or sexual torture, to think about the context and what the nudity means and intends, what is the intention behind it. But we'll continue to try to learn, and please do share your insights and information. I think it would be very helpful on this very confusing, I think, term, sexual torture. Thank you.
Thank you, Maha. Again, if anyone has reflections on that, remember this is open discussion moment. We're a bit beyond timing, but I kindly asked everyone to stay a bit longer. I think we will be closing in a couple of minutes otherwise. And just to say, there's a lot of questions related to other kind of topics. So on stigma, on disclosure, documentation. Just to remind you that we're going to be treating those specific topics on the upcoming sessions. On the 2nd of October, we're going to be discussing stigma, and then disclosure and documentation on the 23rd. I'm going to reshare the full program here, but just so you know. That's why I'm maybe not bringing those questions now. But also anyone who has been sharing questions in the chat, now is your moment to jump on mic. Like you say maybe good also to see terminologies that might open definition. What type of terminologies? You mean like sexualized or? Anyway, well, if there are no further reflections here, well, I see two hands up. Toma, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just referring to the question I asked earlier, if there's any approaches to the prevention of sexual torture, for example, in detention, or yeah, if it's just something that is understandably very hard to prevent.
Anyone who wants to comment on that?
Sí, yo quisiera decir algo, sí, Nora. Es difícil de prevenir, pero con las acciones que comentábamos anteriormente, con respecto a empezar a sistematizar o documentar la tortura, a saber en qué escenarios ocurre, cuándo se da, quiénes la perpetran, puede ser una manera de empezar a generar políticas que eviten que esto se continúe presentando. Sin embargo, requiere como de muchos medios que se coordinen para que se pueda dar una respuesta efectiva y que se empiece a prevenir. Esto no nos debe impedir intentar prevenirla, sino que tenemos que hacer muchos más esfuerzos y coordinarnos más con todas las organizaciones que tengamos a la mano para lograr que se empiece realmente a bajar las cifras en cuanto a tortura sexual.
Una pequeña observación para terminar. Una misma situación, según el individuo, es a efecto psicológico y el otro a efecto sexual. Una misma situación. Por eso no es tan simple desde afuera definir, sino hay que partir de la vivencia subjetiva de la persona. Gracias.
Gracias, Andrés. I'm not sure, Nora.
I was just going to say a couple of words about the prevention part, because I think this is a very important issue. And it's also something for us to discuss with the national preventive mechanisms. We're doing visits on the ground. And as a former member of the SBT with a number of visits to prisons around the world, this is something that has to be looked into. First of all, we have the whole what's happening in the police, what's happening in interrogation, and the need to CCTV interrogations to see that that people are not tortured, including sexual torture. So I think this falls under the whole big work of preventing torture in detention, and we should make this more an issue both for the NPMs, and I know that the SBT definitely is working on this. So thanks a lot. I just wanted to make this brief comment.
Yeah, the one last thing I would add on to that is I think, obviously it depends on the country context that you're dealing with. Where there's NPMs or other kind of monitoring mechanism, I think with that coordination and that awareness raising of what they're looking for, there can be progress towards prevention. But if you're talking about rogue regimes like the Assad regimes or many others that are in power today, then it's, I don't know. The only way I can see is to get them out of power. But anyway, that's why we push for accountability, because we hope that this will be useful as well.
Thank you so much, Christy and Nora, Andres. I think all of these reflections, I'm also mindful of the time. We're 10 minutes beyond time. So I think we'll have to close it here. But many of the issues that have been raised today, as well as some of them in the chat that I'm keeping and taking notes on, will be addressed in the upcoming series. So just for you to understand, this is not we're not closing the conversation here. This was kind of the opening to many more conversations that will be coming up. Again, the next one will be on the 2nd of October on stigma. I will be resharing the program again. Yeah, I will. Oh, I should not forget the poll. So you will see now a poll, satisfaction poll with 3 very quick questions launching on your screen right now, which we really appreciate if you can complete before you leave. For us to continue improving these spaces and to know if they are useful for you. But yeah, again, next one on the 2nd of October, we'll be discussing stigma, then disclosure and documentation on the 23rd of October, and intervention and treatment on the 13th of November. And then at the end, we'll close the webinar series on the 11th of December with Dr. Alice presenting and reflecting on her report that she has been giving some brief bullet points today and key areas. So with that, I will thank you all for being here today with us. Sorry about the timing. I think it's also fascinating to see that there's a lot of conversation, food for thought in this topic. Yeah, so feel free to activate your mics and say goodbye. Also your camera.
Goodbye, everybody. Thanks a lot, and thanks, Berta.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
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 Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you to the presenters and to
Bye.
interpreters.
Thanks so
Bye.
Thanks, Berta. We do hope that you will answer my question.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Yes.
merci.
Yeah.
Bye.
Have a
Bye.
nice
Bye.
I'll save the chat and we'll try to address all of these questions, pending questions.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good to see you, Nora.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Asgero. Thank you.